All right. Well, thank you all for joining us for another of the million episodes of Closing Bell, where we're trying to talk about how the coronavirus pandemic is affecting the supply chain. We've got a special guest today that I will let Trey introduce in a minute. But before, so to keep you guys in suspense of that special guest, Trey, why don't you tell us all of the major news that has happened since we last talked?
I'm not gonna lie, I'm getting tired of talking about major news within a week. I really miss when there was like one story that we could think about, but now it's
Sure
like
enough.
90. But the one that really I think is stuck in everybody's craw is what's going on with meat right now. So the the big one that I think really started pushing the media cycle forward was when the Tyson CEO ran a full page ad in, I think it's the New York Times, Washington Post, maybe USA Today as well, but a handful of places saying, and the quote was just jarring: the food supply chain is breaking. And so since then, the Trump administration has issued an executive order, which is being enforced by the USDA. And at the same time, as we are moving forward, even past the executive order, we're seeing more and more workers in certain places get sick because of this, while certain animals are being euthanized within the hog and beef supply chains, especially. There's a little bit on poultry too, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And there have been the second day stories along with that. So here's an article that I thought was a really nice take about basically that he's not quite right by saying that it's breaking, but more that it's flexing. But we're trying to keep up with this stuff, and I believe it or not, it's not like we have all of the answers, as much as Schaefer likes to pretend that he does. So we thought what would be best is to reach out to the person who is supposed to know all the answers, apparently, if you were to pay attention to the news. So Jason actually is he's very famous. You probably already know who he is. This is just in the last like 2 days. He's been in the New York Times. He was on the front page of USA Today. And if you don't think that any of those news sources are legitimate, here's an article out of Drovers that was literally talking about a lot of the same things. Popular media, yeah, that's great. But what I think is even more valuable for the conversation that we're having is his work on kind of the future of food. So Jason published a book 3 years ago, 4 years ago, maybe, called Unnaturally Delicious. It's up here in the corner of the screen. It's a fantastic read, and it's really kind of a series of chapters that just describes different ways that people are trying to innovate through problems. Now, obviously, the problems, was the word pandemic in your book at all, Jason?
I don't remember, but I don't think so.
I mean, 3 months ago, I didn't really know the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic. So we're all learning, but Jason's been thinking about kind of how the future of innovation looks like in agriculture. That's a topic that we keep getting in terms of questions from the audience. So we thought we could bring Jason on. He's also, if you like TED Talks, he's done like 40. So you can watch some TED Talks in there. This is a photo from one that he did a couple years ago about poultry production and animal welfare. But perhaps most importantly, and this is my promotion. So Jason was my advisor at Oklahoma State, my Oklahoma State hat and my Barry Sanders cup. And while we were there, we were a part of a very good basketball team. We were the grumpy old men. So Jason, he's won like the CAS Communication Award, the Borlaug Communication Award. He's won all these awards. But perhaps most importantly, he was the starting small forward for our intramural team. And we actually made it pretty deep into the Sweet 16 of the playoffs one time. So I've known Jason for a long time, and we're really thrilled to have him on to kind of talk through some of this stuff with us.
Well, good. It's great to be here, and kudos to you and Alex for jumping on this moment. I've listened into a couple of y'all's podcasts. It's been fun, or not podcasts, but these webinars, and so it's been great. And it's fun to be on here. And I think if our team was a grumpy old man, I was the oldest and maybe the grumpiest. Trey was like the young dude that was pushing everybody around. We just throw him the ball, it's like try to get Trey the ball and he'd elbow somebody and make some shots. So I can't claim to have anything to do with our success, but no, but seriously, I think I really appreciate what you all have been doing, and trying to make people more informed and help us think through these things in a more logical and consistent, economical way than you read in some of these headlines, unfortunately.
And so then maybe as much as I'd like to hear more about Trey's braggy basketball days, maybe we can ask you the second most important question, which is, I mean, you're the guy for meat. Is Tyson right here? Is the food supply chain breaking?
I think that USA Today title, I think that opening quote is from me, and I think I can't remember if this was the one in that article or not. They're all kind of running together, but the food supply is not breaking. The meat supply is under a lot of strain and stress at the moment, and so I think it kind of just depends how one wants to think about our food system. But there's no doubt the meat system's under some very serious stress and struggle at the moment. I don't know, maybe we jump into a few of these slides and then talk about the food system more broadly. I didn't put anything in here about the future of food, Trey. We can talk about those things. Maybe we'll talk about the more immediate, and then we can talk about the future a little bit.
Right.
But I think for folks that aren't all that, familiar with the meat sector, to understand what's happening in this moment, I think you have to really understand how concentrated the sector is. So this map I put together shows you the red dots there are the 15 largest pork packing plants. And those 15 red dots slaughter 60% of all hogs, roughly. You can see 2 of them there in Indiana that are, 30 minutes, 45 minutes from me. There's a plant in Coldwater, Michigan, which would be about the 16th largest. So I didn't get that dot on here, but it's actually one of the newest plants, and we can talk about it in just a minute because I think it's kind of instructive. The blue dots are the beef plants, and there it's even more concentrated. So the top 10 plants do a little over 60% of all production. So even from back in early March when I saw a lot of the disruptions in the food supply chain, I always had a pretty optimistic view that we were going to, it's kind of peak stocking out. We'll work through this. It's going to be okay. But even then, I had a sense that our vulnerabilities were going to be in meat packing. I think I even wrote that at near the beginning of March, because these are plants where you have several thousand, at least 2 or 3, sometimes 4,000 workers in a plant. I've been in several of these plants. They're working shoulder to shoulder. And it just struck me, hey, if one of these people gets sick, it's going to spread in this environment. It's a refrigerated environment. And because each one of these plants, each one of those dots up there, is anywhere from 3 to, in some cases, 6% of total U.S. Processing capacity, you lose one, it's enough to make a dent. And that's sort of what we've started seeing. So I think to understand the challenges with the sector, you got to kind of understand the concentrated nature of it.
This figure alone, I don't think people really think about food this way, that like there are certain parts of the country that do a lot of one thing. Like I just don't think, I think you might see a beef cow somewhere in Montana and you're like, okay, so most of the beef cattle production probably is in Montana, but there is this distribution across it that I think is just absolutely fascinating.
You draw a circle around Des Moines, Iowa, about 200 miles, and that's 11 of those pork plants are in that circle.
That's
and
crazy.
You do the same thing around Wichita, and you're roughly, or Dodge City, and you got almost all the beef plants. So, I mean, one upside of that in this kind of pandemic is when a plant shut down, you don't have to go that far to find another big one. But at the same time, it also shows that there's, look at that North Carolina plant. That's actually the biggest pork processing plant. It's about 6 or 7%. What if that one goes down? Those animals got to move a long way to find a home.
Okay, so these producers are thinking like, oh my gosh, like this stuff's coming down, and even Tyson saying this stuff's breaking. Are they thinking we need to diversify? We need to make smaller plants all over the place, or are they still thinking that kind of automation is the way forward?
Well, of course, that depends who you talk to. I mean, my view is that this is going to push us towards a lot more automation. And that's actually where the Coldwater plant comes in. It's one of the newest pork plants. I haven't been through it, but I've heard people talk about it, and I've seen some pictures. that plant actually has a lot more automation. And as far as I know, it's still up and running at the moment. And I don't know, I mean, this is all speculative at this point. Is that because they don't have the labor needs that some of these other older plants have a need? So I see someone in the chat room saying, yes, it is. So there we go. So I do think automation, it will be the way the industry chooses to respond to a lot of this. Now, one question is, could we have more, should we give up some economies of scale? So let me go on a little riff here, and maybe I'll get on a pedestal and y'all can knock me off. But maybe I'll start with the argument. Like a lot of people, so what's happening now is, as we'll see in some slides in a minute, we're down about 40% in processing capacity at the moment. And particularly on the hog side, that's really backing up hogs. And what do we do with all these animals? And sometimes I think people that aren't really familiar with the structure of this industry have some pretty naive views. They're like, why don't you just send this to your local butcher?
Yeah.
So you just take those 2 plants that are there in Indiana. Each one of those plants can do more than 15,000 hogs a day. Every single day. Now they don't normally work.
It's a lot of local butchers.
Exactly. So just as like, so as a total industry perspective, we have total processing capacity of about 500,000 pigs a day.
Mm-hmm.
So we're down about 40%. So that's 200,000 pigs a day that we're not processing that would have been processed otherwise. So, we don't run we run at that for a week, which is roughly what we've been doing. That's 1 million extra pigs that we're going to go to market that didn't. What are we going to do with those? So, again, back to this like local butcher thing, people think, even if you had a relatively, large, small butcher that, let's say for easy math, could do 200 pigs a day, that plant would need to run 100 extra days to make up for essentially one of these large plants going down. Mm-hmm. Or the other way to think about it is, instead of 100 extra days, you need 100 small butchers to make up for the shutdown of one of these plants. And so, yes, I mean, I do think that even if you're working for Tyson or JBS, I would, if I'm working for one of those organizations and I'm looking at the future, I might think maybe we need to give up some economies of scale and maybe build some medium-ish size plants to spread that out, this risk that's coming down if our workforce goes down. But even still, this scale issue is a real. It's not easy to. It doesn't go away,
Okay, so then contrast that with poultry a little bit, because from what I've read, poultry seems to be doing at least fairly better in terms of shutdowns and production.
I think that's right from what I've read, and just to be honest, Trey, I don't know as much about that industry, so I can't speak as much about why it seems to have been less vulnerable to this. And I don't know if it's because there are more medium-ish sized plants. I don't know if it's there is more automation that happens in some of those plants. It's just less. I just don't know. I'll leave it at that. But if you know or you have some speculation, I'd love to hear it.
No, I mean, I really don't. I think, one thing that I kind of, it's maybe one of those, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. 2 of my first 2 moves are like behavioral and then regulatory constraints. But like everything, it sounds like you're talking about, and from what I've read, it's not really, like the panic buying exists, but it's not really, that's the problem. And then the regulatory side matters, but it's this economy of scale thing that matters more. So even though like Wyoming is starting to move toward, allowing butchers to, I think, operate on a smaller scale, I think, and it's still not clear to me that that's really the solution. But I do wonder about substitution of poultry, because it does, from what I've read, it doesn't, I mean, poultry's been affected, but not nearly like pork.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a good question to try to figure out in the future.
Yeah.
So I thought I just would have some shameless self-promotion here.
Sure.
And as I was sitting in a meeting with a bunch of folks on campus here the other day, we were talking about this problem. My dean, my president have been getting a lot of calls about what's happening in the food system. And so I was describing it, and our head of agricultural communications here at Purdue, she said, I mentioned the word, well, it's kind of like a bottleneck. It's an hourglass shape. And she said, wait, can you do can we write a little like Q&A, and can we create a infographic? So this is actually an animated graphic. So if you go to that link, there's some stats that come up, and I think it does help actually illustrate not just, meat, but for a lot of sectors, dairy would be this way too, that you have a lot of farms, but all of them have to go through a much more concentrated processing sector. So at that link up there too, it's a bunch of Q&A. I asked myself questions and answered them. I'm like, why are we dumping milk on the farm, but there's not milk in the grocery store? Like, those kinds of questions are kind of at that link.
I mean, it's super good content. And it's, I mean, the hard part, I think, is that you have a lot of people who are used to understanding agriculture, and then you have a lot of people who aren't. Mm-hmm. So what was nice about this piece is that you actually really are talking to the people who have no idea what is going on.
Yeah. The one really cool piece of this animation, some of those little buildings down there, like the airport, like when the trucks are leaving the plant, like a roadblock comes up to the airport, like they're not buying food anymore. So even though we can, and it gets to your point, Trey, I think people view this meat packing crisis as it's somehow like the same as what was happening and when our grocery stores were stocking out in mid-March, late March, but it's different. I mean, that was caused by an entirely different phenomenon, this sort of disruption from food away from home to food at home and all that.
But can I ask you a question about that, Jason? In your bottleneck there, the fact that we've talked about the big shift from food away from home to food at home, and you've got all these different routes here. On that side of the argument, to what extent is there substitution from airport, where you're saying there's a roadblock, to grocery store?
Some, but it's not as easy as you might think, or the sort of naive view. Well, okay, let's just pick eggs, for example. Restaurants take eggs, grocery stores take eggs, just ship them over there, right? Well, first, there are regulatory problems that prevent that. So once eggs were labeled to go, were packaged in a way to sell for a restaurant, you couldn't then resell them to a grocery store. There were federal laws that prevented that. Now they've relaxed those some, but the other issue is, eggs get sent to restaurants in typically one of two forms: either liquid eggs, so they're already broken and they're big buckets, or on big pallets. And sometimes you see these in a grocery store, but like those foam egg things that you sometimes put under your mattress, like it looks like that with actual eggs in there. And so even the egg producers, some of these egg houses are designed to deliver directly, to restaurants. So you may have a whole facility that's a breaker egg facility that's going into liquid eggs. They don't have, like dozen cartons sitting around to put into your grocery store. And that actually was the problem. There weren't enough styrofoam and cardboard cartons to put the eggs in the way that we buy them in the grocery store. So that, I don't think I put a graph in here, the egg prices, but egg prices increased about 300% there in mid-March. Now they've come almost all the way back down.
Yeah.
And part of that is because we've worked through that bottleneck that's there. And then that same story has played itself out. The details and the particulars are different. I think, my favorite one there is the toilet paper example, because you think about, I think probably two things. One, we probably don't think about how much toilet paper we use away from home, but we use a lot. And so all of a sudden we just needed a lot more toilet paper at home because we're at home a lot more often. And then just think about it when you use toilet paper, in your office or in a restaurant, it's in those huge rolls, and the plants that make those huge rolls are not the same as the plants that make the little small, Charmin soft rolls that we're used to at home. So yeah, I mean, if things got really bad for a long enough period of time, sure, you and I buy a big 50, gallon drum of not gallon, I don't know what units of toilet paper.
I buy in gallons of toilet paper personally.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Pounds, Sure, we would do that if things got really dire, but in the heat of the moment, in the a few days or weeks time, the supply chains just weren't configured for us to buy those huge rolls.
So let me think this through then, because the problem that I mean people are talking about is well, everybody's still eating. It's not like people are just not eating anymore. So in what world does it make sense that like demand has stayed the same and yet the supply has taken such a hit? I don't think that's true, but I would like to hear at least your take on how that doesn't really work out that way.
Yeah, well, maybe just so people know what we're looking on this graph. This is just total cattle slaughter, and you can see really about the beginning of April, we started to drop off. So the last few days, we've been running at about 40% lower than where we were last year. And some of that's because of plant shutdowns, and a lot of that is due to plant slowdowns. So I think we had a question I noticed in the chat already about Trump's order. And I think I've talked to a lot of people. Nobody really knows exactly what it means yet. But I think even if you can order a plant to stay open, it doesn't mean the workers will show up. And even if they do, they're not going to, if they're social distancing, that plant's going to be running at much lower capacity. And that's what we're seeing in a lot of cases in beef. It's not like, if you just look at the number of plants shut down, it's not 40% lower capacity. It's that a lot of the ones that are open are running lower. So, this is almost this reduction in processing capacity is almost entirely, though, due to the COVID issue. The plants are not able to operate at full capacity. They're either shut down or slowed down. So that's the supply side.
So it's a completely different story then. Like the shift in demand doesn't really even matter to what's going on in shortages.
Yeah. So actually, Trey, I thought about sending you this graph and I didn't. Maybe I should have, since you're asking the question. But if another shameless self-promotion, you can go to my blog, which is just my name, jasonlusk.com. And yesterday I put up a graph where we can make some calculations to help us infer what's happening to both demand and supply. And indeed, if you look at the middle to late March, demand was rising because we were all trying to buy a lot to stock up in our freezers and take home. Then demand fell, and then for whatever reason, at least for beef, the data seemed to suggest that demand is rising again, which is a little surprising because my overall sense is that because of the turning off of food away from home, or at least turning down the dial a lot, that aggregate demand, probably was down a little bit. But at least the data I showed the other day is it may be, it's still, at least on pork, it's still probably the case that aggregate demand is still lower, probably because of food away from home being turned off.
Well, but that gets to something that I hate jumping, but this is what I think of immediately. So like the way we talk about pork demand or meat demand is kind of unfair, right? Like bacon demand is not the same thing as ham demand, right?
Yeah. So I think this is really interesting to watch. I'm hopeful some academic out there will write a paper about this. But I didn't get time to update this graph, but I think it just shows, as the title on here says, not all meat is the same. And so this is just a change in wholesale primal cut prices going back relative to the beginning of March. And what you see is that, round and chuck prices increased over this time, kind of leveled off, but then loin and short plate prices fell. Now, why would that happen? Well, round mainly goes to producing ground beef. Chuck is a lot of roast, but you can, the price point is such you can easily convert to round. So that tells me, where the demand was for the relatively inexpensive parts of the animal that could be converted to round. It also tells us what we at home are comfortable cooking easily, and it's also the price point issue. It's just a cheaper part. Whereas, the other aspect to this is loins. And this is the thing I want some academic to write a paper on, is can you use these data to back out what share of these products was going to food at home versus food away from home? That's the thing. I think obviously that's in there because I think loins, probably a larger share of that was going to food away from home. And that's why we saw that, we didn't see that respond nearly as much. And then the other piece, of course, is just the price point. It's just more expensive. The short plate, by the way, that's where briskets come from. Also, the skirt steaks that are in fajitas. So these, think your barbecue restaurants, your Mexican food restaurants. I don't know, but I'm speculating that's why we saw those cuts respond that way.
But so based on this, like if there is this shutdown or slowdown of beef production and pork production, like to me that says like it's not going to affect all of these things the same way, right? Mm-hmm. So like at some point the ground beef demand is what really is going to be driving things because people are shopping at the grocery stores.
Well,
right?
it will roughly
But the prices will increase.
Yeah, it will and so that's why I wish I would update this, because I suspect in the last few days all of the prices have increased.
Yeah.
I don't know, but one thing, we actually, the supply of all of them probably has been affected roughly the same, because every cow has 4 legs, a tail, and a nose.
Yeah. Which is
but
why this
yeah,
is.
but what is different potentially is the demands are really different from those. Also, beef is, that's interesting, because you can take steaks and turn them into ground beef. You can't take ground beef and turn it into a steak. So there's this kind of asymmetry in product conversion. This is just hogs. It's basically showing the same thing, that we've really fallen off. Those little dips right there, this is the problem with dealing with daily numbers. Those are Easter. So they close down on Good Friday before Easter.
Okay.
Well, I didn't realize this when I first put out this graph. I had some emails from people that were like, industry insiders were like, "You idiot, this is Easter. It's not whatever." And I didn't realize this, but Easter was on a different day last year.
Yep.
And you can see that Friday that's there.
Yeah, that dip.
Jason, can I ask a question about these plants? You're saying they're so the ones that reopen are the ones that are taking measures maybe that haven't been hit yet. Do you have a sense of at what % capacity they're operating given the social distancing?
No. Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, Alex, and I don't know. Actually, if somebody on here knows, I would love to hear. But is it 75 or is it 50? I don't really know the answer to that. I mean, actually, you could probably do a back of the envelope calculation here. Right now there are 5 pork plants shut down, and we know their capacity, and it's not. So this is down about 40%, and it's not 40%. It's roughly 20%. So of the plants that are remaining open, you could probably back out sort of what capacity they're running at.
Okay, so the CDC's released this document that says, all right, this is the protocols that people are supposed to follow if they're going to keep their plants open, right? Do we have any sense of what the CDC protocols would do to the capacity of these plants? I mean,
that's kind of what I was trying to ask.
Yeah. I mean, the spacing certainly will slow down.
Yeah.
The plant, and that's the part I don't know the exact numbers, but one thing that it is doing is I've noticed in my local grocery stores here in West Lafayette, I don't know if y'all have seen it, but a lot more meat in vacuum packaging and a lot more whole muscle cuts showing up. And that's a direct result of less labor. So most of the labor in these plants is in, what you might call disassembly. Taking, those primals off the animal and then further breaking down those primals. And so if you don't have as many people in there, what you're going to do is package them much more, whole muscle cuts. The other part of that too is this whole food away from home. We send a lot of the stuff we send to restaurants is packaged in these much bulkier vacuum packaged things. So I don't know. Have y'all seen that in your grocery stores, or is that just me?
I have not been to a grocery store in like a month.
I haven't either. I have no clue. Can I ask a question? Exactly related to that, which is if they are operating at some reduced capacity, and we think about the fact that demand for animal source proteins, I guess we can say, is roughly unchanged, and so we may have some substitution among those things. Are there other, do you expect to see substitution from beef or pork towards something else? Is there more flexibility in one of those supply chains with less bottlenecks that are able to adjust more rapidly?
Yeah, I mean, it does appear, for what reasons that we don't know, or that at least Trey and I don't know, the chicken seems to be less affected. So you're right, just relative, it's going to happen through relative prices, that prices reflect scarcity, and prices serve to ration scarce resources. So maybe we look at the next slide here, Trey. I think the prices are on here. Here's beef.
Yep.
Beef wholesale prices. You can see really since mid-April have been just taking off like crazy. In fact, that's about a 60% increase since middle of April.
These slides are fascinating to me because like I stole your data from your blog post like a week ago or 2 weeks ago, and you could see the bump, but you didn't see the takeoff.
Yeah.
And so like I had to update because like it's a completely different story than it was like a week ago.
It is. I know. That's been the amazing thing here. So I'm going to answer Alex's question, and then maybe get back to this. So,
Yeah.
So that point we saw, this is yesterday's price at yesterday afternoon's wholesale box beef price. That's as high as we have seen in at least the record of the data set I have, which goes back about 20 years. So of course, people are going to cut back when prices rise to that kind of level. What are they going to substitute towards? Actually, pork overall, the level is cheaper. So even if prices are rising in pork, you may substitute toward pork. Chicken is definitely cheaper. And that, actually the story of meat over the last 30, 40 years is the rise of chicken. And people speculate as to why. Was it health concerns or whatever else? A big part of that substitution can be explained by the relative price changes. Chicken just got a lot cheaper over that time period.
And how about the responsiveness of quantity or the availability of chicken, say, to this change? Are we able to increase our supply of chicken?
Yeah.
I
mean, all these products have biological lags, but for chicken, it's certainly much shorter, and they've been able to, kind of pull back, production more quickly. So the typical broiler chicken that you and I eat in the grocery store is about 6 weeks old. So they can 6 to 7 weeks old. So they can turn that around much faster, either increasing or decreasing. Right now they're decreasing somewhat because of the slowdowns for them too, but their ability to be able to change and respond is on a much faster scale than the other proteins. Now, some people talk about other proteins that you might substitute towards. Eggs would be one.
And what's the biological lag there?
It's a little longer because you need to get hens that can get to the age to lay eggs, but certainly faster than certainly cattle. But you think about the other proteins, like beans, lentils. That's an annual, seasonal issue. So it's not like we're going to ramp up there. So that is one question I've asked. Is like, sometimes the vegetarians that I'm friends with, on social media, I've seen some of this, and like, like, good for us. And so you better watch out. People shifting away from these products towards other proteins are going to pull up prices.
And so we actually got a question about that right now, which is, what about demand for meat substitutes?
Yeah. This is that before COVID happened, which so now it's COVID all day, every day. Before that was pretty much plant-based meat all day, every day. So it's like from one topic to the other. So still a very, very small share of the market right now. But, if the things that all these headlines are saying are going to happen, which is you do start getting some limited availability, some stocking out for meat, you may get people trying these plant-based alternatives that haven't done it before. And, maybe that makes some people more likely to try them again. Maybe some people don't like them, but I think, early on, I saw some of the people in the kind of plant-based, industry commenting when that little hump that's there with the beef, you can see the same hump in terms of sales with plant-based, and its percentage growth was huge. It was like 160%. But of course, that's right. Starting from a very, very small base. And I haven't seen updated data on that, since we kind of gotten over that hump with everything else. I'd be really curious to see that.
There was a story in the Financial Times like a week ago where they were saying like, this just really shows the plant-based proteins are going to take off. But like, I mean, if you look at any of the IRI scanner data of grocery store sales, you just saw a hump there. Like it didn't really matter what the product was. It's pretty consistent, even if we were talking about the bread section.
Yeah.
And I think probably in this next one too, not so much on pork prices.
So the one thing I'll say on the pork price side of things is, even though you see the same run up in prices, actually that increase from middle of April till now is like 70% increase. You can see we just barely got above last year's price just now.
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of kind of relative to history, like the current price doesn't seem, is it that far off of what we would have expected, like modeling wise? Or was it back in on April 9th that was actually the anomaly?
Yeah. So beef is certainly an anomaly. Pork, so the thing that was going on with pork is coming into this year, we had a really high inventory, a lot of pigs that were on feed. And a big part of that was we were expecting to sell a lot more to China. So an African swine fever problem in China, they had to kill off about half their hog supply herd, which by the way is bigger than the whole US hog herd. And as a result, we know, and we thought some of these trade tensions would settle down. And so we were really ramping up as an industry. The industry thought it was going to be a really good, really profitable year. So some of this fact that prices are, kind of, holding a little lower than we were is because we had a lot more throughput already coming into this year. And in fact, we have more cold, at least at the end of March, which is the last data we have, a lot more pork in cold storage at the end of March than we've had for the last 4 or 5 years.
Got it. I do think though, go for it, Trey.
We have more pork in cold storage. So that to me would mean that we should be less concerned about some type of meat shortage on pork, right?
It should be, yeah. And so to give you a sense of scale there's about 10, if we shut down every pork plant and and prices didn't change and consumers just kept consuming at the same rate, we would have 10 days roughly of pork in cold storage. All this, by the way, is private storage. There aren't like government strategic stores of pork as they have in China. It's all just commercial storage of people trying to, look for opportunities and that kind of stuff. The other thing to keep in mind here too that also mitigates against the shortage is trade. So over 20% of pork is exported. Mm-hmm. And a lot of those export markets are places that have been pretty hard hit by this virus: China, South Korea, Japan. And as a result, I think those storage and trade are helping, so far helping pork not get too out of whack at least on this consumer side. I think, I guess I've made this point to a lot of journalists. They want to talk about consumer shortages. I think, that's fine to think about. I think most of the pain here is on the farm side, not the consumer side.
Yeah. Well, and that's something that is just kind of strange to me because people feel like, well, consumers are going to go, like, they're going to starve to death. But like, did you see the SNL sketch this last week about grocery stores?
I haven't actually seen it, but I've heard several people reference it.
Well, so it's like a 3-minute sketch where they're like, there are certain things that are stocked out, but the sriracha flavored Oreos are fine. And so like, it's not like we're going to starve, right? Like
and that was one thing, back in that,
problem.
That first peak, in mid to late March there, that's one thing I tried to encourage people. Hey, all those pictures you see on Twitter of stocking out, look in the background. There's almost always food in some other aisle.
Yeah, right.
And so it's just that your favorite brand or variety wasn't there, and you just had to be a little more flexible, I think, and I think the same thing with regard to meat. There may be some limited availability, prices may rise, but there will be some other options. One other thing I'll say on that point too is, hearing people in the grocery sector, one of the things a lot of the food manufacturers have done and retailers have done is stop stocking the sriracha flavored Oreos. Like, just do the main thing, and so they've really actually cut down on the variety just to make sure that they're these are in the food processing plants, just getting out like the most popular things.
Okay, so so now we're at this meat point where it's like, okay, it's not like we're going to run out of protein. It's just that you might have to consume the protein in a way that you're really not used to. Fair?
That's kind of the way I look at it.
So, but can I ask, the point you made there was, okay, so on the consumer side of things, maybe it's not as dire as people are saying, and we've got this extra benefit that the meat source that's most able to adapt in the short term is luckily the meat source that hasn't been hit the hardest. So it's kind of good news over there. You said on the other end of stuff, things potentially look really bad for farmers. Mm-hmm. And I wonder about the story you shared at the beginning, the concentration of the meat processing industry. Some people have griped about that, but one of the potential arguments for the good a benefit of that is that they have these incentives to ensure a long-term source of their product. So they're going to try to protect or ensure the survival of their farms. Mm-hmm. Is there some of that story right now? Is that a bright spot, or is that unrealistic?
So I'm going to answer a different question than the one you asked.
Okay, so you're Trey.
Like any good politician, that's what they do. I'm going to answer a related question and hope you don't realize it wasn't the actual question that you asked. One is, so people have made some analogies on the pork side to what happened in the late 90s when there were really severe, drops in pork prices. Is this different? And one thing that is different is the pork industry is much more vertically integrated than it was then. I think about 40%, if I'm not mistaken, about 40% of hogs are produced on a production contract, which means actually that the farmer doesn't actually own the animal. They're getting paid for basically space. So if you're in a production contract, depending on what the fine, print says on that contract, you may not be that adversely affected at the moment. So your exposure depends a lot on your relationship with the packers and that kind of stuff. Now in cattle, much less of that sort of thing. And this gets maybe more directly to what you're asking. It's a pretty populist, been a pretty populist moment, I think, in the cattle sector for a long time. And so this phenomenon that's happening right now, we've been talking about increases in wholesale and retail prices. The thing we haven't shown is at the same time, livestock prices are falling. Mm-hmm. That makes, to me, perfect sense from an economic standpoint that there's a disruption in the processing sector so that the meat packers can't move as many animals. So their demand for livestock has fallen. We don't need as many. There are too many animals relative to our ability to process them. So livestock prices are going to fall. At the same time, I'm not able to produce meat, less supply of meat on the market. That's going to drive up meat prices. So I think from an economic standpoint, the data we're seeing makes perfect sense to me. But if you're sitting there as a cattle producer, you're saying, hey, look, my price is falling, retail price is increasing, so, I'm getting screwed. And I think just from a pure image standpoint, it looks bad. I think what you don't observe, so it looks like the margin for the packer is really increasing.
Right.
What you can't see is the packer's cost.
Yeah.
And all this shutdown, slow down, social distancing, installing panels, and all that kind of stuff. That they're incurring an enormous amount of cost. So my general sense is nobody is better off from this situation. Consumers are worse off because they're paying lower prices and not being able to buy as much. Farmers are certainly worse off. They're not able to sell. The prices are lower.
Consumers are paying higher prices.
Oh, right? Sorry. Yeah. Consumers paying higher prices. None of us like to pay higher prices, so we're worse off. Farmers are worse off. They're lower price for livestock. And the packers, I think this, as I'm not going to say there isn't or is not market power or whatever, but I'm just saying they could have chosen to shut down these plants beforehand if they wanted to. The fact that they didn't and suggests to me they'd like these plants to be up and running. And in fact, they seem to be working hard at doing it, is, their preference is to have the plant up and running. So that tells me they're worse off too. You can actually look at stock prices of most of the at least the publicly traded meat packers, and they haven't fared very well during this crisis either. They fell quite a bit during this middle to late March. In the past few days, it's come up a little bit, but I don't get the sense they're a lot better off either. So we want a scapegoat to blame. If we want one of those, my view is it's the coronavirus. But I think coming out of this, there already was coming into this, because of the plant fire we had in Kansas back in August, concerns about market concentration in this sector, and this is just going to renew calls for that, and the courts will settle that out. I'm not going to settle it here, but I'm saying the price changes we're seeing do not require there to be market power. Mm-hmm. There could be market power, but I'm saying that doesn't have to exist to see the price changes we're seeing.
Fair point.
How is that in terms of not answering your actual question?
But that's,
you said things though.
I said things. Yeah.
The problem is if you talk to anybody on social media who is kind of on the ranching side of things or on the animal production side of things, the immediate response is that it's the processor's fault. And that's almost across the board. That's like the first thing you hear. But it does kind of strike me that if they had wanted to, they could have shut these plants down before, and they would have, it's not clear they would have made more money then either. It's just But I feel like it's cold comfort. You know, I mean, like there you have these producers who are losing their shirts right now, and you know they are feeling the strain, and I get that they want to like point the blame at somebody. It's hard to think that there are no winners here, but I think you're right that everybody's losing.
But I do think it is probably fair to say that the livestock producer is losing the most. And I think that's sort of and I think if I'm in their shoes, that is the injustice of it that they feel from their perspective is my, I think point of view, but, or my sense of things. This does get a little bit to, something you mentioned a little while back about the structure of the industry and those kind of things is, everywhere I've worked, there's always been some groundswell to try to build a packing plant in the state to deal with some of these margins. And sometimes that happens, and often they don't fare very well. So I think so economies of scale are really important. But at the same time, I do think coming out of this, it's useful to ask, what are the barriers to entry in this sector? Regulation is certainly one of them. Is it the major thing? I don't know that, but it certainly is a factor. You have to pay a federal inspector to be there at all times when you're operating, if you want to be able to ship across state lines, and that alone is a pretty significant barrier. And so I think that's the way I think about these issues is, let's make sure there aren't undue barriers to entry into these sectors.
Are there, so I like where you're going here. Are there other, or is this the primary way to incentivize kind of resilience in these supply chains in the future? Is removing the barriers of entry, in your mind, the way to do it, or are there other ways to incentivize resilience?
I mean, that is sort of my preferred way. And, I think generally speaking, we think if these people in the processing sector are earning excess profit, that is the incentive for new people to enter. As long as there aren't these, kind of legal barriers. By the way, I think one of the barriers that will prevent there from being more of these mid-sized packing plants, whether they're new startups or, one of the incumbents building a new plant is, there aren't a lot of people that want a packing plant in their backyard. I don't know, y'all probably read the stories about Costco trying to open up a chicken processing plant in Nebraska and the community really fighting back there. And so I think that's sort of the challenge here is I think a lot of the same folks who would say, we need to break up these packers, we need more small packing plants, or in many cases, some of the same groups that would say, but not in my backyard, but put that packing plant somewhere else. I don't want that there. So that's another reason we see that concentration in many ways is, look at those areas where those, particularly the beef plants are. There's not a lot of people in those areas. Yeah. So you think about if there are externalities, whether it's, smell or wind or whatever, one way to minimize those externalities is make sure there aren't many people around. And so that there is a sort of endogenous selection of location that goes along with, the regulatory environment and then just sort of the socio-political environment.
But Jason, I think you just talked yourself out of the relaxing barriers of entry as being the solution in that that answer, right?
Yeah, well, no, exactly. I was, so my preferred, approach is to try to see what we can do to reduce barriers to entry. But one of those barriers is something that's really hard to change. So I want to try to be realistic about how far we can get with some of that.
So then surely the answer isn't that there is no way to incentivize more resilience in the future. From policymakers.
Oh, well, there are ways that are pretty draconian. I think they would, it's a research question, but how much, what's the cost we're willing to pay for that resiliency is maybe one way to think about it. So, you could have a Teddy Roosevelt, break up the Packers, law, that could happen. The question I would have is what's the cost of that to the system?
So actually, I was, when I asked the concentration question, I was taking the other side of things, which is the more, whether I have market power or not, the more my future supply depends on the existence of these farms, the more I'm incentivized to ensure the future existence of these farms. Mm-hmm. And so theoretically, if there is market power in these industries, the more market power you have, the more they're incentivized to look out for the health of the survival of these farms in the future.
Yeah, or or a lot more vertical integration and coordination. And it's been a lot hard. It's harder. Just been a lot hard to do at beef cattle because you get beef cattle raised all over the United States, and because you need a large land base for that, which is expensive. Maybe I'll shift gears for a minute, and again, I'd say more shameless self-promotion, but at this point, I guess I've promoted myself enough. It's not shameless anymore. just promotion. So one thing I'm working on, this is just a crude drawing, but I'm hopeful in the next week or two, I'm going to be able to release a tool on a website that I've been working with some people at Microsoft on to create something that I'm calling a food and farm vulnerability index. And the basic idea is this: we have data on COVID cases by county, and a lot of us have seen that reported in the news. You can go on websites and click on your county and see the number of COVID cases. What we also know is we have data on number of farms and also number of farm workers in each county. So we could take those two maps and we can have essentially an estimate of the expected number of farm workers that have COVID. By the way, if you do that, I don't have the active version of it up here, but if you do that, those counties that have meat packing plants, they're hotspots there. So the data is kind of showing up right. And what we can do is layer that on top of production of any commodity. Obviously production is seasonal and all that kind of stuff, but putting that to the side, what you can do is combine all those things and essentially ask a question like, if you know the kind of labor productivity associated with producing, say, vegetables, and we know the number of COVID cases in that county, ag worker COVID cases, at least an estimate of it, we can calculate a share of production that's at risk. So that's a little tool we're hoping to develop and layer on top of some of these discussions. And I put the vegetable one here because it's kind of interesting. You can see where all the potatoes are in Idaho there.
Yeah.
But if you put but this does get to the question a little bit of geographic concentration and some of that kind of stuff, because
sure.
If you put beef cows are everywhere, all over the United States. If you put broiler chickens, they're mainly in Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. So they're different commodities have different geographic distributions, and as a result, there are different vulnerabilities for different commodities. And obviously, this is a crude measure because it depends on when you're planting, when you're harvesting. We don't have any of that temporal dimension in here, but I think it's a useful way to think about sort of risk of to something like a pandemic.
But I mean, even on the confirmed COVID cases, I mean, that's kind of the wild card too, right? I mean, it's not exactly clear that we're measuring exactly where the COVID cases even are.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's it is a little frustrating actually, even seeing a lot of the news reports of the stuff that a lot of the underlying data here is challenging.
Yeah.
What about the production function itself, where some of these commodities are a lot more reliant on labor than others? I wonder, just even in vegetables, is there some kind of anecdotal story about? Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to have data on that. You're exactly right. Just from what I know about the industries, the amount of labor you need to produce a bushel of corn is much lower than the amount of labor needed to produce some equivalent amount of lettuce or tomatoes or something like that. Unfortunately, we don't have great data. What data we have from, say, USD Ag Census, it can tell us the number of farms. Part of that's a joint production problem. There's a farm that could be producing multiple things, so we don't know how to allocate labor across those. Yeah. So as we were starting to build up this tool, I was trying to figure out, can I get labor by commodity? That data just doesn't really exist in good ways that were useful here. But I do agree with you; it is an important issue that would be a nice feature to add in here. So if I can get a funder, to give me a lot of money, I'll try to dig up data.
Speaking of, here was the chart of the day from the USDA. This is the average share of production that is comprised by labor and harvest for selected crops, and it is so there is something there that I think is super interesting. Somebody actually just asked if there was going to be a produce specific closing bell, which I think the more Jason you're talking, the more it sounds like we need to kind of dig into not just meat, but we also like almost have to have a different episode on produce, right? So
I agree.
Problems on produce are going to be different, right?
Oh yeah, and it's just I'm talking about meat because that's what I know. and, but but it's a different story, and I think from what I saw after telling you it's something I don't know, I'm going to talk about it. But the challenges we're seeing in produce are very different. That you don't have the same labor in packing plant problems that you're seeing in meat. It's a different story, that's playing out there.
Oh dang it! Here it is. Okay, so this was one thing that I wanted to throw at you just to get your take on. I don't know if you saw this article in Bloomberg the other day. So this is about renewable energy, and so the figure on the left is the change in annual energy demand by oil, coal, gas, nuclear, renewables. And so the article itself is claiming that that renewables are the big winner here. And then they show that in terms of percent change in emissions, we've seen this like record drop in the amount of emissions in the United States, or is it the U.S.? I think it's international, global emissions. So Schaefer and I have been arguing about this a little bit because like I thought the article was interesting, and Schaefer's take was, well, no, oil prices, coal prices, gas prices are all coming down. So if anything, renewables are the big loser in this. One thing that sticks out is, we still have a lot of livestock production, right? So like what's the deal with this record drop, even though the livestock production is still there? I would just like to hear your kind of thoughts in real time.
Yeah. So say that last part again.
Yeah, there were two different, Trey, you're talking about two different issues right now. One is GHG emissions.
Yeah.
And the second is the future of energy sources. And so the question that Trey asked is about that first production of GHG emissions. And so the figure on the right-hand side is Trey has looked in this more than I have, but this is the predicted emissions per year, or the change in emissions per year over time. And he's showing, or Bloomberg's showing a huge drop in emissions in 2020. And Trey's saying, well, if livestock accounts for a huge share of emissions in the US, and the amount of animals isn't going to change that much, why are we seeing this huge drop in emissions? Is that what you're saying, Trey?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, exactly. I think I think this gets to the point that a lot of people in the livestock industry have made, which is, if you look at EPA's numbers, for example, it's mainly beef cattle because the numbers, and they produce methane, which is a pretty potent greenhouse gas, but it's still roughly 4% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So, a change in the number of cars driving has a much bigger impact than a change in numbers of animals. I think that's partly what you're seeing in these data.
Well, to me, it starts pushing toward this question of the future of food and agriculture, because like you said, before COVID-19, everybody was talking about plant-based proteins as being this way to curb emissions, while simultaneously providing some future that allows us to step away from some of the non-renewable sources. But it seems to me that, at least with COVID-19, it's not clear that we're going to see that trend continue. That's my take.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing to, I guess this graph doesn't have biofuels in here, but I don't know if that's what's in renewables, but
the ethanol part.
This big policy, if there's a big drop in gasoline demand, and we're requiring a bunch of that demand for biofuels is to blend with gasoline, that's a big drop off in biofuel demand, at least.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so those are all reasons why, if we're talking about that left-hand panel there, which has the headline "Renewables are the winners in the decline in energy demand," I'm not sure that that's an accurate reflection of the future.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, to be honest.
I was kind of hoping that this would push you kind of more toward like talking about kind of your future thoughts on like where the food and I don't know, ag economy is moving. You know, ethanol, I think for a long time people thought was going to be one of the big future movements. But I don't know, is that still in the mix? And if that's in the mix, is also some of the other plant-based proteins, more renewable energy or ag and food sources, are those also things that are in the mix, or where do you think things are moving?
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously a lot of dynamics there. I mean, I think the sort of rise of digital agriculture is there, and the use of more on-farm data, kind of robotics, both in, say fruit and vegetable harvesting, and the ability to make more, precise decisions about whether it's fertilized applications or seeding and those kinds of things. I mean, that's already here now, but I think we're moving much more in that kind of direction. Those things are probably going to continue to increase farm sizes because it enables, one person to manage more ground because of the availability of those data, to keep track of what's happening in all those places. Now, I don't have a good sense of what energy is not a sector I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and so I don't have a really good sense there. I mean, other than to say, falling energy prices is generally good for farms that need tractors and fertilizer. Mm-hmm. So that's at least some good news. While commodity prices are falling, that maybe at least one of their input costs should be helped a little bit by some of this. I do think, if we want to speculate a little bit about kind of future, what food might look like, I do think we already touched on this. I think we will see a lot more automation in the food processing side of this thing, and I think probably actually in the retailing side too. And already people have, people that had never used a grocery store pickup service or the kind of Uber Eats or whatever. There's a lot more people that have tried those in the last month than they ever have before. Mm-hmm. A lot of the grocery store pickup or even delivery, the way that's being done at the moment is they're still, the stockers are still going into the same store that you and I walk in to buy our groceries. But I think this was already happening a little bit. I think it'll further move in this direction. You may have these micro fulfillment centers that it's like a grocery store, except it's not for you to walk into. It's only for machines. Think about Amazon warehouses or something like that. It's to fulfill online orders. And, we may be buying a lot more of our food in that way that gets delivered to us in that fashion. If that's true, I could imagine, now I'm really speculating, I can imagine grocery stores that are a lot smaller. We buy our packaged items through, something that looks...
Meaning grocery stores are a lot smaller, meaning many more firms, or just the on-site location is a smaller location?
I'm mainly thinking square footage of the physical retail space. Okay. So they're moving some of their space out to a warehouse somewhere. Okay. Yep. And so we buy our packaged items from online, but most of us want to go pick out our meat and fresh fruits and vegetables in person. So maybe we have smaller stores, square footage wise, that we go and do that in, or maybe we go to more farmers markets, that kind of thing. I don't know, but that's sort of some of how I see this playing out. But a lot of it, I think, is getting back to this both cost of labor, mm-hmm. and just the fact that labor now we know is vulnerable to the spread of diseases. Of course, arguing against myself, about to be a big unemployment rate, so there's going to be a lot more available labor than we've had in a long time.
Sure enough, yeah. That's a great point. Yeah.
Well, we're running out of time, but I will shamelessly promote for you. Here are the two books. Definitely buy either of them. This is the one that I think probably is more relevant to the conversation that we're having right now, about kind of what the future looks like. There's some like super weird topics in here, including like chefs that are all technology and automation, where like you have a robot basically that makes the food for you in your kitchen. And so like there's all kinds of strange stuff in here. Jason's book's Unnaturally Delicious, so very much worth checking out if you haven't already. But thank you so much for joining us. really appreciate your insights. This has been extremely helpful, not just to me and Schaefer, but I think to everybody that's listening.
Yeah, this was fun. Sometime I should come back on and let y'all talk more.
No, we'll probably just.
No, I like it how you're both me and Trey. You give the argument and then you talk yourself out of it. This is perfect.
Yeah, that's right. If you just let me talk long enough, I can convince myself of almost anything.
Well, thanks, Jason. Really appreciate you
Yeah.
on board.
Thank y'all.
All right.
Thanks so
Take
much.
care, everybody.
Bye, guys.